Hello and welcome back to this 5-day bootcamp on data analysis using Power BI. So today we are on day 4 and a quick understanding of what we've done so far. We've worked with one single case study in the past, and yesterday we started with the second case study that was based on working with relationships. So yesterday towards the end of the session, I did discuss how we can deal with data coming in from multiple tables and what should be done when we have data coming in from multiple tables and connect them. So a very quick set of questions that I'm going to put across to you. I want a quick answer and reply from you in the chat. uh, First thing, I'm sorry, I just forgot to confirm, is the audio and the video absolutely clear? There are no queries with, I mean, there's no problem with it? Is there any problem with it? Okay, so I haven't received any update so far, but from what I can see and look at on my screen, on the other screen that I have, I'm just going to increase the volume a little. Yeah, yeah. So I can hear my voice absolutely clear on the live YouTube live as well. Okay, so a quick update on what we've done so far, and this is the notes that I'm sure would have been shared with you as well on the Notion doc. So on day 1, we looked at what is the concept of Power BI. Why is Power BI so important? What are the different components of Power BI? We also talked about how to set up Power BI, the different views that we have in Power BI, and then we learned how to import data from different sources. So we have only explored the Excel data source so far. We have not looked at the SQL server so far. Okay, then I did talk about a little bit of transformation in Excel, in Power BI, how you can use the Power Query editor for changing the various data types and transforming the data as well. We also then spoke about the various data modeling concepts like hierarchies, then creating relationships. We will talk about DAX basics today. I will also talk about what is data normalization and what are the basic concepts of normalization. Then we will talk about how to work with the different types of visualizations. So we have the different visualizations that are available. I did show you some of the visuals that are there and how to customize them in terms of the options we have. Then I'll talk about what are slicers, how do we use slicers to work with it. Also, I will talk about the different advanced DAX functions. So today we're going to focus more on the DAX functions and working with it, dealing with how to work with the various DAX functions as well, and working with the time intelligence functions like year to date, month to date, etc. Then we'll talk about the data aggregation. Data aggregation options as well, and we'll talk about how to deal with multiple data sources and how to work with them as well. And finally, tomorrow I'll talk about the Power BI services and how to publish the services, how to deal with the dashboards. Sorry, I think I have not shared my screen. Okay, sorry. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Perfect. I've just shared it now. And these are the things that we have been looking at and some of the important aspects. Okay, so let me go about with the calculations today. So yesterday I talked about how we can create calculations in Power BI, or where we can create the calculations. So I did speak about 3 important areas where you can create your calculations. The first thing I mentioned was you can create your calculation in the source. You can also create your calculation in Power Query, and then the third, you can create your calculation in Power BI. Okay, so I've already shown you source. We are already aware of how to create it in Excel, normal Excel formulas. Power Query, I already showed you how to use the custom column in Power Query or create a custom column in Power Query. Now I'm going to talk about the Power BI. So this is where we introduce ourselves to the DAX library or the concepts of DAX. Now, as I mentioned, DAX stands for Data Analysis Expressions. Now, if you can see here, I've already created a column using Power Query in the invoices table called as Revenue PQ. PQ is basically to annotate that this is from Power Query. Now, what we are going to do is we're going to understand how to work with this and create a simple DAX calculation called as revenue. Now, in order to create the revenue, I'm going to go about to the report view. So you can go to the report view, or you can even go to your model view and then work with it. So I'm going to go to the table view and show you. When I click on the invoices, you can see here, I've got this revenue PQ. So first thing, let me just change this unit price to $1. Also, I'm going to go back to my customers table and see if there's anything needed to be changed here. And for the product cost also, I'm just going to change it to a dollar formatting. Now, even though I changed it in Power Query, I had to change it here because I'm using the Indian date format and the Indian formats that I'm working with. So now going back to my invoices table, here I'm going to go and create a revenue column, but this time it's going to be a calculated column. So remember, when I select the table, I get the table tools tab. And if I click on any column, I get the column tools tab. So I did mention that these tabs that are available are referred to as contextual tabs. Now here, in terms of the calculations that are possible are measures, new measure, quick measure, and new column. So I'm going to click on a column. And when I click on this new column, right now I'm actually creating something called as a calculated column. Okay. So I'm going to rename this column, or I'm going to give a name to this particular column as revenue. And in the bracket, I'm going to write CC, which indicates calculated column. And then I put an equal to sign. Now, what I need to do here is I need to just take the unit price and I need to multiply it by the quantity. So you can see here, it is actually picking up the name of the table before the column. And that is something you should do. It's a best practice to put the name of the table and then pick up the column name. So let's go ahead and hit the enter key on our keyboard. Now, when you hit enter, you will see immediately a new column is created. I'm just going to click on the dollar formatting so that it picks up the dollar formatting. Now, I have purposely created this column using the table view. I could have done it from the report view or from the model view. Any of them would have been absolutely okay. But the reason for creating it is so that I can see exactly what the calculations are and whether they are the same. So you can see every calculation is exactly the same over here. Now, the next thing that I need to do is I need to check in terms of the report view. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create the same calculation. So I'll just select this and I will add one more field into this visual, that is the revenue calculated column. When I do that, I will have this converted into a scatter chart, but I will just retain it to look at from the clustered bar chart. So this is the chart that we actually see. Now you can see both the bars are exactly the same size in all the states, which indicates that our calculation is absolutely perfect. I'm just going to remove it and I'm going to zoom in for you so that you can see exactly what the icon looks like. So you can see here the icon for revenue, which is a calculated column. It looks like this with the sigma symbol, and it's more of like a table with the sigma. This indicates as a calculated column, and this is just the sigma symbol. So this is a normal column. So as I mentioned, if I create a column in Power Query or I pull the data in from the source directly, the columns will be treated in the same way, but only a calculated column will be slightly different. Now remember this, whenever you create a calculated column, it should be having the columns from the same table. Now this is where there is a small problem, because the next thing that I need to do, the next business metric that I need to create is the profit KPI or the profit business metric. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull in the profit, or I'm going to calculate the profit. But in order to calculate the profit, I need two fields. So what is the formula for profit, everyone? What is the formula for profit? Anyone? Quickly. What is the formula for profit? So profit is equal to sales, or you can say revenue minus cost. Okay. sales or revenue minus cost. Now, yeah, it's SP minus CP. That's right. Beauty's help. That's right. Now, remember, when I am trying to calculate this, you can see I have got the revenue column here. Okay, I can use the calculated column or PQ. Any of them is absolutely fine. But the problem is I don't have the cost. But I do have a product cost column in the products table. Now, if this was Excel, what I would have done is I would have flattened my table using a VLOOKUP function. But here I don't have a lookup function that I can run. Okay. So how do I create my formula? And another problem is I have to make sure that the column is within the table, but the cost column is not there. So I cannot create the profit column. But that's not a problem. We can go to the invoices table and click on new column. Now look at the DAX formula I'm creating. Okay. The name of the column is going to be cost. And I'm going to start with an equal to sign. So let me just write cost in bracket, right, calculated column, close the bracket, equal to. Now, obviously, it's the quantity because that is something I need. And I'm going to multiply this by product cost. Now, the moment I start typing product, I will only see a formula called product and product X, which is not going to work for me. So I know that this is in the products table. So even if I try to type the name of the table, it's not going to work. But there is one very helpful function that is going to help us save the day over here. What the name of the function is, it is called as related. So if I start typing REL, I will see there's a function called related. And here I can just press the tab key and you will see it says returns a related value from another table. Now, please keep this in mind that whenever I'm using a related function, I have to ensure that all the relationships have been already created. If the relationships have not been created, when you type the related function, you will not see any list of columns, something that appears here. Okay. So I'm interested in product cost. So I'm just going to type I'm going to select this and then I'm going to close my bracket and hit enter. So when I do that, I do have the cost also calculated. Now let me go ahead and in the visual library, I'm going to click this drop down and you can see there are various visuals that are possible to be created. I will try to create something called as a table visual. And here I'm going to go ahead and create a table visual with the state first, then followed by the revenue, which is going to be maybe a calculated column. And then I will also pull in the cost, which is another calculated column. And let me go back to my table view and change I could even do it from there. So I can just change it to a dollar formatting because these are all international numbers that are there. Could you please give an overview of how many videos will come and what topics we'll learn? Okay, Praveen, what is this query regarding in terms of how many videos will come and what topics will we learn? I'm really not aware of what you're actually asking. If you can just put a clear query, then it'll help. Okay, anyways. Now here I go back to my report view and I'll just increase the font. So here when you select the visual, you do have this format option. So under this, you've got the data pane, then you've got this build pane. Okay. And then finally, you've got this format pane. So click on it. And here you can search for, if you're not, like you're new to this, you don't know things, you can just search for the property you're looking out for. So I'm looking for font. If you can't find font, maybe you can even look out for text. But I think font should do the trick for you. Now here for the global font, I'm just going to change it to 20. And I'm going to increase this so that we can see it better. Now I'm going to add the next calculated column, which is going to be profit. Now for the profit, again, I can go to my invoices table. So I can either select the invoices table or I can select the column that I'm going to use here. And then I can create a new column from here. And for the new column, I'm going to call this as profit is equal to, and then I'm going to say revenue less the cost. You can hit enter and you will see a new column will be created. So I'm going to also rename this as profit bracket CC. The reason I'm putting this with CC, I've been saying this from the beginning, that these are basically calculated columns. So let's look at our table view and we can see now I've got the profit column. Again, change it to a dollar formatting and let's add this to our visual. So I'm going to select the visual and I'm going to go ahead and click on the profit column. Now, when you do this, you can see the calculation is very clear. It's 135 minus 67,289, which is about $68,400.25. So this is the calculation and it's absolutely correct that we're getting. Now, the next thing we need to do is we need to now calculate the profit margin. Now here, I can create a calculated column for the profit margin, but I will not do that. Because when I create a calculated column, I'm going to get an error. I'll explain you how. Okay. So just help me do this. Okay. Find out what will be the overall profit margin. So the overall profit margin is going to be this value divided by this value here. So if I actually do that, what number am I going to get? What is the profit margin am I going to get? Okay, Abhida, Ranjan, what is the difference between M? Are you specifying M language and DAX? So M language is basically the language that is used to write Power Query queries, whereas DAX is basically used within Power BI. So M language is used in Power Query and DAX is used in Power BI. Okay, and also Power Pivot, that's in Excel. Can you please explain for DAX? DAX is what I'm just showing you right now. It's a language that is used to write calculations or complex calculations in Power BI. Okay. How to rename the column names? So if you want to rename a column name which you've created, you can just select the column name. If it's a calculated column, you can just select the column name and you will see the formula appear here. You can just go ahead and change the name from here. That should do the trick for you. And if it's a normal column which has come from the source, you will have to right click and then you will have to click on rename and then you will be able to rename it. But please remember, don't rename it inside Power BI. Go back and do whatever changes you want to do in Power Query. Don't do it from here. Okay. I hope all the questions have been answered for everyone. Okay. So Darshani, you've given me a number that is 54.35. So that is what I'm looking at. At first, I was wondering why have you put this number? Okay, great. So I'm going to see whether I'm getting this 54.35 correct as my calculated column. So again, go back to the invoices table, click on new column. And here I'm going to write the name as profit margin. And then again, here I put calculated columns in bracket. I mean CC in bracket, and then I'll put the equal to sign. And this time I'm going to divide my profit by the sales. So revenue, not sales, but revenue. Now, when I hit enter, I have calculated the profit margin. Now here, obviously the profit margin is going to be a percentage. So I can select profit margin and click on this percentage symbol. Now comes the challenge to check. Okay. So I'm going to select my visual and see whether the calculation is correct. So here you can see the problem of profit margin is infinity. Now this is because one, there are a lot of zeros in the data. So that is one major issue. So if I go to the table view, you will see that there are certain values over here where the sales value is 0. That is because they have been offered as free products. So you can see here when these are 0, they have been offered as free products. So you will have to make a few changes in your formula and calculation. But anyways, the others are all calculated. So what I'm going to do for the revenue column, or basically the profit margin column, if the revenue is 0 or if it's basically a 0, I'm just going to put in here as 0. So whenever there's an error, I'll just put a 0 over here. So for the profit margin, I will use the if error formula, if error, and then I'm going to see if I get a blank value here. Just leave it blank or maybe 0 and hit enter. So you can see I'm getting 0% here. So now I think if I go back to my report view, even then, the value is a very highly inflated value. That is something close to 32,540, which is close to impossible to have. Now, this is because when I'm actually performing a calculation, the calculation is working on something called as row context. Now, please understand this. This is very, very important to understand the difference between this row context and something called as a filter context, which I will come to later on. Now, what happens in case of a row context? How has this 3190.97 percentage figure been achieved? So what happens here is, for the entire invoices table, the calculation of the profit margin is done by first going ahead and looking at all the states and filtering out the data for the state and taking the total of it. Now, obviously, the total is going to be added 74.56% and so on and so forth, whatever the numbers are. But that is not how we need to calculate the profit margin column. So first thing, I'm going to get rid of my profit margin column and I will delete it from here. So let me delete it from the model because this is an incorrect calculation. Now, let me explain this to you with a little bit more clarity. You'll get a little bit more clarity on this if I explain it to you in a different way. So here I've got this sheet where the calculations are to be done. Let me just close the sheet behind it. Okay, now if you look here, I've got the quantity, I've got the unit cost, I've got the unit price, and then I've got the revenue and the cost calculated and the profit calculated. Till here, everything is absolutely fine, no issues. But when it comes to profit margin, even I can look at, okay, P1 is selling at a profit margin of 71.65%. But the calculation here is incorrect if I take a total of this. Okay, if I take a total of this by saying I want the calculation of this, it gives me 254.23%. Now, remember one thing. Whenever we are working with any percentage values, you will never directly aggregate them. Okay, directly aggregate them. The reason we do not directly aggregate them is because when you're doing a percentage comparison, you cannot do a percentage comparison directly because the denominator, because I'm taking my profit as the numerator and revenue as the denominator. The denominator can never be the same in this case because every product will have a different set of revenue, and even if one or two products have the same revenue, you cannot still compare them. So what you essentially need to do in this case, and that is the aggregation rule that you need to follow. So what you will do, you will take the total of the revenue, you will take the total of the profit, and then you will calculate the value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide the total profit from all the products by the total revenue, and then I'm going to get something like a 46.93%. Now the question is, how do I revert back to this? So this is where you will need to understand another very important concept called as filter context. Now, this is where the concept of measures come into picture. Now, all this while we've been working with calculated columns, I'm going to show you how to work with measures in this case. Now, in order to calculate your data or to create the calculations using a measure, or in order to create a measure, you go select the table. Now, remember in case of a measure, okay, remember in case of a measure, you are not bound to use the columns only from the table you're creating your measure. So measure gives you the liberty to pick up fields from any other tables that you want to pick up the data from. Okay, so I'm looking at the questions before I move ahead very quickly. While dividing sum of profit with sum of revenue, okay, Darshini, sorry, that was right. Not those columns, visual table column, sum of profit as profit. Okay, you want to rename it as sum of profit. Okay, Prajot, I'll just come back to that. So can we do these calculations in Power Query Editor? Remember, Abhida, you can do these calculations in Power Query Editor, but the measure creation cannot be done in Power Query Editor. You have to do it in Power BI. Okay, that is one thing you need to remember. Anyways, now for creating a measure, okay, let me go back to the report view, and here I'm just going to, okay, Here, I think somebody did ask a question. Prajot, if I want to rename this, so for example, I just want to show this as revenue and I want to show this as only cost or this only as profit, I can go ahead, right click here and click rename. And here I can just call this as only cost. And I'm going to see that this is going to be, okay, no, this is not updating. Okay, 1 minute. Okay, these are the filter panes. Okay, I'll just get back to you on this because this normally doesn't really require you to update it, but I'll just get back to you on this. Okay, so with respect to this, I think these are normally updated based on the calculations that you do, but you can go ahead and make a few changes on this. Let me get back to you on that. Okay. I'm selecting. Okay, fine. Now coming to the data pane again, and here I'm going to go to the invoices table. And instead of creating a new column, this time around, I'm going to create a new measure. But before I directly create a new measure and show you how to write the DAX calculation, let me work with something called as a quick measure. Now I click on quick measure, and here I'm going to click on the calculation. So there is an option to create a quick measure without writing a DAX calculation. So here I'm going to look out for something which is a mathematical calculation called as division. Okay. So I click on division here, and my numerator is going to be the profit. So the total sum of profit. Okay. I'm going to click on the invoices and then I will select profit calculated column. The moment I click it, it will automatically aggregate it to the sum. If I want to change this, I can click on this button here and then I can change the summarization to something else. Okay. I can even go and change the sum of the profit to any other column, but I won't do that. I'll go and add the denominator. So my denominator is going to be the sales or revenue. So here I'm going to add revenue, and you can see here I have sum of profit and then sum of revenue. Let's click add. And when I click add, a new measure is created. Now, when a measure is created, you will notice that the measure is going to have this calculator symbol. So the calculator symbol indicates that this is a measure, and this symbol, which looks like a table with a sigma, indicates it's a calculated column. So I'm going to talk about the differences between the two very quickly. Okay. For now, let me add this and see whether it's working perfectly fine. So I select my table and then let's add this. Now, this is exactly what we get. Now, the only thing is I need to change this, the name. So first, when I click on it, I have this measure tools tab that opens up. Now here you can change the name. So I'm just going to change it to profit margin. And in the bracket, I'm going to write M, which indicates this is a measure. But anyways, the, symbol will give away that it's a measure. But if I look at it in the measure tools, I should be able to see, or just by the name of the column, I should be able to see it. Then I can change the home table to any other table in the data model. So I won't do that because I don't need that. Let me just change it to a percentage so I can see the profit margin correctly. Now, as the calculation by Darshani has been given, 54.35 is exactly what we have for the total profit margin of the organization. And accordingly, the calculations have been done. So have you understood why we need measures and in place of calculated columns? Has everyone understood this quickly? Okay, please explain when we need to use the new column and when to use DAX and new measures. Okay, Rajguru, I'm coming to that question now. Now, whenever you're dealing with any numerical calculation, okay, remember this is a very important point. Whenever you're dealing with any numerical calculation, always use a measure. Now you'll ask me, sir, but you've already created a calculated column. Why would you not create a measure right in beginning? I did create the calculated column, but I'm going to show you how I'm going to create a measure in place of a calculated column in these cases. So what I'm going to do is, first thing, I'm going to go to my invoices table, and here I'm going to click on something called as new measure. So I click on new measure, and I'm going to create a revenue measure with revenue, and in the bracket I'm going to write M, close the bracket, equal to. Now what I just need to do is I need to take a total of the entire revenue column. That could be one approach. And that approach, so if I write the total is basically the sum. So if I write sum, hit the tab key. Now in this case, remember, in DAX, the catch is you should know exactly what kind of calculation uses what syntax or what inputs. So in this case, as the name suggests, sum function adds all the numbers in a column. So you just need to give a column name in this case. Okay. In this case, I need to give a column name. So if I write invoices and then let's say revenue calculated column and close the bracket and hit enter, this is going to be a new measure created. Okay. Now I will go to a new sheet and show you what is the work. So I've got a Power Query column created. I have a calculated column created, and I have a measure created. Let's just add all these. So I'll add state. I'll convert this to a table format, and then I'll keep adding everything else. But before that, let me just go ahead and change the formatting with the font to be about global font to be about 15. Okay. A little better to read. Now here in the same visual, I'm going to add first my Power Query column. Then I'm going to add the calculated column, and then I'm going to add the measure. Now this measure, I'll just change it to a dollar formatting. Now please understand that this is coming in from Power Query. This is coming in from a calculated column. Both these are using row context, whereas this is a measure which is using a filter context. Okay, filter context. Now this filter context is basically that the calculation here is the overall calculation. So you will notice if I go to the table view, just let me go back to the table view. Now in the table view, you can see you've got the revenue Power Query column, the revenue calculated column. But can you see the revenue measure here? You cannot see the revenue measure. So keep that in mind, that whenever you're working with your data, if you create a measure, the measure will not be seen in the table view. There's a very important reason for that. Pay careful attention to this point here. Whenever you create a measure, the measure is going to be saved in the data model. Okay. But there is no calculation to be done for every row. Okay. Whereas when you create a calculated column, it gets saved with every row having a value for it. Okay. And in the case of a measure, the measure is only calculated whenever you call for the measure. So right now I have called for the measure for this breakdown. So basically what it's doing is it is just giving you, it's actually only saving this number. But based on the underlying data model, it is calculating the value for all the states for you. And that is why it is using something called as a filter context. So I hope everybody has understood this. Have you understood what is calculated column and measure? Everyone? So Rajiguru, I hope your query has now been answered. Whenever you perform any numerical calculation, always use a measure. Now to give you a little bit more understanding on why only a measure and not a calculated column. So for that, I'm going to take you to one website, okay, or basically a link, which is measures versus calculated columns. Okay. So please understand that there are different reasons why we create calculated columns and measures. So first and the foremost, in case of a calculated column, okay, so there first let's look at the similarities. So in terms of the similarities, calculated columns and measures both are calculations that can be added to the semantic model. Okay, they are calculations that can be added to the semantic model. They both will be defined by a DAX formula. You will write both of them using a DAX formula. And third is you can reference them in the DAX formulas directly. So if you notice, in measure, when I created the profit measure, a profit margin measure, I was able to reference a calculated column inside it. Okay. That is what you need to understand. Now, where are the areas that they differ? So first and the foremost, what is the purpose? So calculated columns will always extend the table. They will always add a new column whenever the column is created. Whereas measures will define how to summarize the model data. So it will just summarize the model data for you. In case of evaluation, now calculated columns are evaluated using the row context concept. Okay. And they are always at the data refresh time. They use the row context concept. Whereas on the other hand, measures are evaluated using the filter context at the query time. Okay, so you're using either a row context or a filter context. In calculated columns, you use row context, and in the measures, you use filter context. Now, remember, if you understand the concept of filter context and how it works, you will be able to very easily work with complex summarizations. The third difference, storage. Now, calculated columns first, if you use the import storage mode, so when you're actually storing or working with the data, there is a storage mode that you can choose when you pull in the data. So this stores a value for every row in the table, but a measure never stores values in the model. Okay, it is always calculated only at the time of it being called. So the question is, how does it work? So the measure is loaded on the random access memory, and the calculation is done whenever you are calling for it. The fourth one is visual use of it. Now remember, calculated columns, like any other column, can be used to filter, group, or summarize the data, okay, as an implicit measure. Please remember, calculated columns are also referred to as implicit measures, whereas measures are often used to, or are always used to, summarize the data. They are used to summarize the data. Now the question is, measures, normal measures, they are referred to as explicit measures, because these measures have been created by you for the purpose of working with it. Whereas calculated columns are used for any sort of aggregation, and hence they are called as implicit measures, because whenever you bring them to the visual, their job is to aggregate and give you a single value. So I'm assuming that your concept of a calculated column with a measure has now been cleared. And most importantly, you've understood whenever you're dealing with a number, you will always go for a measure. Now comes the question, when will we use a calculated column? Now I'll give you an example. Okay. So let's say I go back to my Power BI and I go to the table. Now in this case, I have been asked to extract the quarter from the date column. That means I should know what is the quarter of this particular transaction, or the month of the transaction. In that case, you cannot create a measure, because measure is only for numerical fields, obviously continuous fields. So in that case, you cannot create a measure. So how will you extract that information? I'll go to a new column here and I will write month, okay, is equal to, and then I will use a function called month, and I will provide it with the date of the transaction. So I think we do have the date column, and that date column is just date. So when I just use the date column, invoices date, be careful, because there's a function also called as date. You don't mess up with it or mix up with it. So when I create a new column here, I've got month, and this shows you the month number, which is 1, 2, and so on and so forth. Okay. So based on this, if I want to see which month have I got in terms of the calculations, I can very easily get the month calculation done. Okay. Okay, so I'll just delete this because this is not really a required thing, because we already have information available. So going back to my calculation of the profit margin measure. Now, I have already created a revenue measure, which is called sum invoices revenue. But this is not really of something that I would want to do because this is a very simple measure. You can create it, but in the first place, what I would want to do is I would not want to create a revenue calculated column. I would directly want to create a revenue measure. And why is that so? The reason is because I can do that very easily. So I'll show you how the revenue can directly be created. Okay. So what I'm going to do is, we all know that the revenue can be created using the unit price and the quantity. So I'll do this. I will start off with equal to, and then here I will use sum x. Okay. Now, sum x is an iterator function. What this does is, this does exactly what the sum function did for you on a column. But the only difference is, in this case, you are not providing one column, because what the sum function needs, it needs only one column. But in case of a sum x function, it requires you to provide a table and the expression that you would want to calculate within that table. So I need to get the total revenue, okay, but I need to calculate the revenue row wise within the iterator function. So at the back end, what it does is it calculates row by row, but it gives you a summarized value. It doesn't create a column for you. Now remember, every time you create a column, you are increasing the model size, the data model size. Now, because we are dealing with a smaller data set, it's okay, but you should be very clear that you should use a measure every time you want to work with a calculation, which is a numerical calculation. Now comes the sumx function. So for the sumx function, I'm going to write the table name. The table name is the invoices table. You hit the tab key to invoke it, comma. Now comes the expression. So the expression is basically going to be my quantity that's in the invoices table multiplied by the unit price. Okay, now you close the bracket and hit enter. Now when I hit enter, I'm expecting that, okay, it will be created as a measure here. The measure will show up here, but it's not showing up here because it's not a calculated column. The measure is going to show up in your invoices table in the data pane with a calculator symbol, which means it's correctly calculated. So I go to my report view, and this time around, I remove my Power Query revenue. I remove the calculated column and the measure as well. And this time I use only the revenue measure. Okay, so I'm using this measure, which is calculating based on an iterator function. So I can use the same technique to create a cost measure. Now, in order to create the cost measure, I'm going to go back to the invoices table, go to new measure. Remember, whenever you are trying to create a sum x or an iterator function, or use an iterator function to create a measure, the quick measure will not work. The quick measure was just to show you how to work with the DAX calculation without writing it manually yourself. So the system or Power BI writes it for you. Okay, going to the cost measure. So I type cost, and in the bracket I type M, close my bracket, equal to. Now here, the function that I'm going to use, measure is not a virtual column. Abhida, remember, it's not a virtual column. There's nothing called as a virtual column. It is a measure and a calculated column. Don't consider measure as a column. It doesn't exist in the table for you. It is going to exist in the model, but not in the table for you. And also, it will only be calculated whenever you call for it based on a filter context. Okay, so don't get confused. It's not a virtual column. I hope I've answered your query. Okay, now for the cost, I'm going to go again and I'm going to use the sumx function. This time I'm going to use the table again as the invoices table, and my expression is going to be the quantity multiplied by the product cost. But you remember, I don't have the product cost in my invoices table. So in that case, what function will I use to retrieve the product cost from the product table? Quickly, I'm waiting for you. I want an answer quick, please. What function will I use to retrieve the product cost from the products table? Related. Very good. Absolutely fine. So I will use the related function. Thank you. Beauty's help. You've really been helpful on this. Related is the name of the function, and I will use the product cost column, close my bracket, and then I hit enter to get my sum of the I get the cost. Now, one small mistake I made here, I closed the bracket for the related function, but I forgot to close the bracket for the sumX function. Please keep these small things in mind. Even though Dax was kind enough to close it for me, but it's always better you check, because sometimes one bracket here and there with these long functions and you will be ending up in a soup, in a problem. So please be careful about that. So I add my cost, that's my measure, and I'm going to go and change it to dollar format. Now comes the profit margin calculation. So, or profit calculation. So for profit, I've been using this calculation, which is a calculated column. Now see, these measures that I've created, okay, the revenue and the cost, these are simple measures that have been created. Okay, this is a measure that is using a sumX function, okay, an iterator function. Now comes the next measure, which is a profit measure. So I don't have a profit measure here. I'm going to click on new measure, and here I'm going to type profit with an M in the bracket, which indicates it's a measure. And then I'll put an equal to sign. And here I will use the two measures that I've just created. So it's going to be revenue, which is a measure. Now, please remember, when I start creating a new measure and I try to find out like for profit, I was trying to in the past I used a profit calculated column, and where I use the revenue calculated column. So the moment I type REV, you will notice it only shows me the revenue measure. That is because in a measure, if you're trying to reference a column without any aggregation, it's not going to work for you. I'll explain you how. So if you can see here, in my profit calculated column, this is where I can directly use columns directly, okay? But when I try to create a profit margin, revenue measure here, I cannot directly reference it. If I try to do that, it's not going to work. That is why I had to use the sumX function, okay? So I'll go back and I'll create the profit column, the profit measure again. Profit in bracket M, close the bracket, equal to, and then here I will use revenue, which is a measure, and I will subtract the cost, which is another measure for me. Okay. So remember, when I'm creating a measure, and if I try to use a column name in the measure without any aggregation, it's not going to work for me. So keep that in mind. So my profit measure is now created. Let's add it to the visual, and that's created. It's the same value. Let me just change it to a dollar formatting. And now comes the last part, that is my profit margin calculation. So here I'm just going to change it. So the measure, I will change it to the revenue, profit measure, profit measure divided by the revenue measure. Now, in this case, instead of using the if error function, which I showed you, I will just use a divide function. Now, what this divide function does for me is it allows me, okay, so it gives me the liberty to pick up an alternate result. That means if there is a zero, or basically a calculation error like an infinity error wherein I'm trying to divide by zero, it will handle it and return zero for you. So I'll just hit enter. And when I do that, okay, so sorry, I put in the wrong syntax. So the syntax is the numerator, which is the profit measure, then a comma. I was not supposed to put the slash because that's the normal way of dividing the data. Then I will put in my denominator, which is the revenue measure. And then I'll just close my bracket and hit enter. I'm going to get the profit margin measure created. I can add it directly. and here it's in a decimal. I'm going to change it to a percentage. So I've got 54.35, which is the calculation for me. So I've shown you how to create measures using DAX. We've learned how to work with the basic functions like sum and also an iterator function in the calculation over here as well. So we've learned the basics of DAX. I'm going to show you how the visualizations are also there. What are the different kinds of visualizations that you can work with and how you can work with the slicers, etc. So here, let's just go ahead and delete this and let me create a simple report here. Now, in order to create a report, I will be using multiple visuals from here. So first things first, let's look at the different visuals. So whenever you're dealing with the bar chart, so I'll show you one by one all the visuals. So first is a clustered bar chart. Now in a clustered bar chart, when you add it, you will need a quantitative field, like let's say the revenue measure, and you will need a qualitative field, that is, let's say the state. So I break this down. This is a clustered bar chart. Now, if I add one more categorical field here, that is, let's say I'm adding the product line. Now, what this does, it automatically gets converted into a clustered bar chart, which is already there. But here it adds a legend for me, which means here I can see there are now 3 columns for 3 bars for each of the states and different colors, which indicate the different product lines. Now, using the same visual, I can go ahead and keep changing them and see what is the impact of it. So let's just change it to a stacked column chart or a stacked bar chart. Now, when I change it to a stacked bar chart, okay, I think I should have changed it to a, yeah. Now, in a stacked bar chart, now you can see the total for Georgia, but also you can see the breakdown for each of the different product lines. This is the advantage of using a stacked bar chart. The third one is a 100% stacked bar chart. Now, what this 100% stacked bar chart does is, it gives you the total as 100% for every single state. So the height or the width for every single column is going to be the same. Not visible properly. Kavya, what do you mean by not visible properly? If you can please let me know. I don't really understand. What do you mean by that not visible properly? Okay. So in this case, you can see the breakdown is happening, and you can see here product is about a good 51.32%, and then here close to 50% is consumables, whereas accessories is really small, which is about 1.84%. Okay. Now, Alabama is the only state that has got the maximum maximum percentage of the overall revenue for accessories is 6% as compared to the others. Okay. Now, in this case, we can also look at the other charts. Like I've looked at bar and column is exactly the same, so I'm not going to cover that. Let's look at a line chart. Now, in case of a line chart, you need to have a time series analysis. So for example, here I'm looking at revenue, and then I'm going to add my date over here. So I add the date. When I add the date here, I can see it's only 2013. So I'll just drill down to the next level. Okay, I get this quarter-wise data. So a line chart requires you to have a time series analysis. Now I can also further add state to it, and you can see I will be able to see the different lines for the different states. Okay. Maybe I could go to the month level, and these are some of the calculations here. Or maybe I could add the product line. So it will break down that value, and this is what you can see across the 4 quarters. Now, the important thing here is if I want to look at only the direction, I use a line chart, but I also can use a area chart if I want to look at the magnitude of change as well. So here I also have something called a stacked area chart, which gives me a better understanding of things. So you can see product is consuming most of the area on the chart, which means product happens to have the maximum revenue throughout all the 4 quarters. Then the next thing you have is the waterfall, funnel, and scatter charts. These are some advanced charts that are there. So I don't think we're actually looking at that for now. Let's talk about the slicers now. So let's say I've got 2 visuals. One is this, and the other one is another visual, which is a table visual. Sorry. Another visual, which is a table visual that gives me the breakdown by the different states. So I begin by adding the state, and then I add my revenue, and then the profit and profit margin, just for an understanding. Now here, if I go ahead and want to filter my data, I can use a slicer. Now when I add a slicer, I can click on this button here under the visual gallery, insert a slicer. So when I add a slicer, I have the ability to add any field to this slicer. So let's say, for example, I go ahead and add maybe the product line. Now when I add the product line here, and when I click on any of these slicers, any of these, it automatically updates everything based on that particular product line. Okay, so for here you can see consumables, you can see products. Now every visual, you can make changes to its properties by selecting the visual and go to the format pane. In this, you've got visuals and you've got the various properties for that particular visual. So depending on what visual you're actually looking for, like for example, size and style, the visual border, the grade, whatever you're looking for, you can change it from here. You can even search for the property in this particular search box here. Okay, so we've looked at slicers and how they work. Now let's look at cards and KPIs. So normally cards and KPIs are basically used in situations when you want to highlight something. For example, if I try to create a simple report here based on these two visuals. Now I also want to look at the profit margins, etc. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add the multi-row card. I can click this drop down here, and amongst the gauge, card and KPI, I've got something called as card, normal card, which gives you only one single value, and also the other one that gives you a multi-row card. So you can keep adding multiple measures to it, or multiple KPIs to it, not measures in the actual concept, but then in with respect to Power BI, but then the business calculations that you want to work with. For example, I pick up card here. Now in the card, I'm just going to go ahead and add maybe, let's say, the revenue. Okay, so this is basically giving me a total. Now here, the good part is when I click on any particular calculation, or I click on any particular slicer here, automatically everything is going to be updated for me. So you can see accessories gives about $20.4 thousand. Now here I'm going to go ahead and put this right on top, but instead of using a single KPI card visual, I will use a multi-row card visual. Now in a multi-row card visual, what you can do is you can have multiple cards that you can assign. So here I'm going to assign, let's say, the quantity. I'm going to assign, let's say, the profit, and then the profit margin. So we've got profit and then the profit margin. Now the good part here is that again, this responds very easily to any of the slicers on this. Okay, so here you can see you've got the accessories, which is giving you about 1,188 total products sold. Then you've got consumables, and then you've got the product itself. Okay, so this is how you deal with the cards and KPI cards. Now remember, cards and KPI cards are great for displaying key metrics of your business, like total sales, average sales, etc. Okay, this is how you use the different KPI cards. Now, in addition to that, you have many other visuals that are there. Okay, you can create a pie chart, you can create a donut chart, you can create a tree map chart. Let me show you some more visuals from the visual gallery. So amongst these visuals, another very useful visual is something like a combo chart, or a line and stacked column chart, or basically, let's say, a line and clustered column chart. So here I just manually go ahead and create a chart here, line and clustered column chart, and in this case I'm going to add the fields for analysis. So let's start by adding profit, then the profit margin, Now this shows up as a very small value here, and I'm going to drag profit margin to the line axis. Well, now when I select any visual, you will see that you have got the option for line y-axis. Okay, it goes to the y-axis. Now when I add something to the x-axis, which is a categorical field, it will automatically break down. So for example, here I add state. This will break down, and then you will be easily able to read this. Okay, so if I go to the focus mode, you can see I've got this analysis, okay, wherein North Carolina, even though the sales or the profit is very low, but its profit margin is very, very high relatively. Now I can go to the format pane and I can look out for something called as a label. Okay, I've got data labels. I can just switch them on, and based on this, you can see the data labels are available. I'll just apply it only to profit margin. Okay. I'll just keep it only for profit margin. So I'll select profit here and I will switch it off over there. Okay, that means it will not show it for profit. It will only show it for profit margin. So here you can see 59.17% is the total profit coming in from North Carolina. There are other visuals that are also available that you can work with within Power BI. Okay, you can work with maps, etc. Let me just show you one last one, that is tree map. Now, a tree map is basically used in a case when you're trying to create a hierarchical chart. So you can use this tree map option. And here, let's say I'm adding a measure or basically a continuous variable, which is my profit. Okay. Now I'm going to break this down by the state, and this is what I get. And further, maybe I want to break it down by the product line. So you can see within this, the product line is working. I can also go ahead and remove product line from details, drag my state from category to the details area. And here I can look at the, so for the category, I can drag product line over here. So now you can see by the product line, how are the different states divided. Obviously for accessories, it's really very small. You can barely see anything about it. Okay. So this is how you deal with the tree map. I think we'll stop here for today. But before I move ahead, does anyone have any queries with respect to today's session? Any queries with respect to today's session? Difference between cards and KPIs. See, when you're dealing with cards, okay, here I've got something called as a card and a multi-row card. Card is one single KPI that you can visualize, and multi-row card is using multiple visuals that are there. Yes, Bhagyanand, today's class was difficult to digest. Absolutely, because today the level of the complexity was relatively higher than what was expected. So if you're not really like with or you've not really worked with Power BI before and it's completely new for you, it will take some time for you to understand. But don't worry, I'm assuming the recordings of this would be there. I'm not really sure, maybe the admin team would be able to tell you that, but please go back and watch it and try to solve it with the video. Then you are going to really have the main advantage of it. Okay, I think I'll close it for today. I hope everybody had a good session today and you were able to understand everything. Okay, so thank you everyone. Have a great evening, and I will see you tomorrow, which happens to be the last day for our boot camp. Thank you.